The fork clattered against my plate as my sister Jennifer's voice cut through the Thanksgiving dinner conversation like a blade. David, when are you going to get a real job? This security guard thing is embarrassing the whole family. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against the mahogany table as she exchanged knowing glances with her husband Kevin, whose Rolex caught the dining room light. I mean, 8 years in the military and this is what you have to show for it. Checking ID badges at some office building. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My father Robert set down his wine glass with deliberate precision, the sound echoing in the suddenly tense room. Your sister has a point, son. At your age, you should be thinking about your future. Real career advancement. Not playing soldier and pretending it matters. The disappointment in his voice was nothing new, but it still stung every time. My mother Linda nodded in agreement. Her lips pursed in that familiar expression of disapproval I'd grown accustomed to over the past 18 months since my discharge. Kevin leaned back in his chair with that smug expression he wore whenever he was about to deliver what he considered profound wisdom. Look, Dave, I get it. Military service sounds noble and all, but in the real world it doesn't translate to actual success. You need connections, networking, business acumen, things you don't learn in some desert somewhere. He gestured toward himself with obvious pride. Take me, for example. MBA from Wharton, 6-figure salary at Goldman Sachs, partnerships lined up for next year. That's what real achievement looks like. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I looked around the table at faces I'd grown up loving, faces that now seemed to regard me with a mixture of pity and frustration. My younger cousin Marcus, home from college, was scrolling through his phone, probably posting about our dysfunctional family dinner on social media. Even my grandmother, who used to be my biggest supporter, seemed to avoid eye contact, focusing intently on cutting her turkey into impossibly small pieces. David's doing his best, came a quiet voice from the end of the table. Amy Rodriguez, my girlfriend Jessica's best friend, had been invited as usual, though Jessica herself was notably absent, claiming she had to work late at her marketing firm. Amy had always been kind to me, unlike most of Jessica's social circle who seemed to view my military background as some sort of character flaw. Not everyone needs to measure success the same way. Jennifer's laugh was sharp and humorless. Amy, that's sweet, but David needs to face reality. He's 29 years old, living in a studio apartment in Tempe, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and working a job that pays barely above minimum wage. Meanwhile, his high school classmates are buying houses, starting families, building actual career. This whole finding himself phase needs to end. The truth was, my family didn't understand what I'd actually done during my 8 years of service. They knew I'd been stationed overseas, knew I'd received some commendations, but they'd never bothered to ask for detail. In their minds, military service was something you did when you couldn't figure out what else to do with your life. A detour before getting serious about real accomplishment. They certainly didn't know about the classified operations, the lives saved, the intelligence gathered, or the reason why I'd been personally recruited by Tech Global Industries for what they assumed was just another entry-level security position. Maybe, my father continued, his voice taking on that lecturing tone he'd perfected during his 30 years as an accountant. It's time to consider going back to school, get an MBA like Kevin, learn some practical skills that actually matter in the business world. This military stuff was fine when you were young and directionless, but now you need to think about your future. I pushed my mashed potatoes around my plate, trying to find the right word. How could I explain that I'd already been thinking about my future, that the position at Tech Global was exactly where I needed to be, that everything was unfolding according to a plan they couldn't possibly understand? How could I tell them that sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows, that true value isn't always measured in salary figures and corner offices? The thing is, Kevin continued, warming to his favorite topic of David's failures, employers these days are looking for innovation, creativity, business development skills. Military training teaches you to follow orders, not to think independently. It's actually a disadvantage in most corporate environments. You're basically starting from zero, except you're almost 30, and competing against people who've been building relevant experience for years. My phone buzzed with a text message. Jessica's name appeared on the screen. Sorry, can't make dinner tonight. Something came up. Range. It was the third family gathering she'd missed in the past 2 months, and I was starting to suspect that her work emergencies were becoming conveniently frequent whenever my family was involved. Not that I could blame her. These dinners had become increasingly uncomfortable for everyone involved. And another thing, Jennifer was saying, clearly building momentum for what promised to be a lengthy critique of my life choices. This whole military hero complex has to. I see the way you carry yourself like you're still in uniform or something. David, you're a civilian now. You work in corporate security, checking badges and making sure doors are locked. It's time to adjust your expectations accordingly. Amy shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her loyalty to Jessica clearly conflicting with her natural instinct to defend me. I think David's experience is valuable. Leadership skills, discipline, ability to work under pressure, those things matter. In theory, maybe, Kevin replied dismissively. But have you seen his apartment? Have you seen his car? If those skills were so valuable, wouldn't he have something to show for it by now? The market doesn't lie, Amy. If David's military experience was truly worth something, he'd be compensated accordingly. The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing. The caller ID showed Mike Sullivan, my old unit buddy who'd also transitioned to civilian life recently. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but anything was better than continuing to sit through this character assassination disguised as family concern. Excuse me, I said, standing up from the table. I need to take this. I walked out to the back patio, grateful for the cool November air, and the temporary escape from the suffocating atmosphere inside. Mike's voice was cheerful as always, completely unaware that he was interrupting what felt like a tribunal. Dave, how's the family dinner go? Let me guess. They're giving you grief about the job situation again. Mike had met my family on several occasions and had witnessed their attitude toward our military service firsthand. Listen, I just wanted to give you a heads up. I'm hearing some interesting chatter about tech global industries. Sounds like there might be some big changes coming down the pipeline. Nothing concrete yet, but you might want to keep your ears open. Through the sliding glass door, I could see my family continuing their discussion, probably analyzing my character defects in greater detail now that I wasn't there to defend myself. Jennifer was gesturing animatedly while Kevin nodded sagely, no doubt sharing additional insights about my lack of ambition and poor life choices. Thanks for the intel, I replied to Mike, keeping my voice low. Things are definitely interesting around here lately. Can't say much over the phone, but there have been some unusual developments. I figured as much. Just remember, brother, sometimes the best operations are the ones nobody sees coming. Your family might not understand now, but they will eventually. Trust the process. After ending the call, I stood on the patio for a few more minutes, watching the sunset paint the Phoenix skyline in shades of orange and purple. The city sprawled out below us, millions of people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, fighting their own battle. Most of them had no idea about the complex web of security and intelligence that kept their world safe, the quiet professionals who worked behind the scenes to prevent disasters they'd never even know were possible. When I finally returned to the dining room, the conversation had shifted to Jennifer's latest case, something involving corporate litigation that allowed her to showcase her legal expertise and substantial billing hours. The relief on everyone's faces when I sat back down was palpable. They much preferred discussing Jennifer's successes to analyzing my apparent failures. So anyway, Jennifer was saying, the settlement ended up being $12 million, not bad for 6 months of work. Kevin and I are thinking about upgrading to that house in Paradise Valley we looked at last summer, the one with the pool and the 3-car garage. My mother beamed with pride. That's wonderful, honey. You've worked so hard for everything you've achieved. It's nice to see it paying off. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Jennifer's accomplishments were celebrated and applauded, tangible proof of success that everyone could understand and appreciate. My 8 years of military service, on the other hand, were treated as an unfortunate detour, a phase I needed to outgrow in order to join the ranks of productive society. David, my father said, turning his attention back to me with renewed determination, I've been thinking about your situation, and I have a proposal. Kevin has connections at several firms here in Phoenix, good companies, stable positions, opportunities for advancement. If you're willing to be realistic about your expectations and put in the effort, I'm sure we could find you something suitable. Kevin nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. Entry-level positions obviously, but with room to grow if you're willing to work hard and learn the business. Sales, customer service, administrative support, the kind of jobs that actually build marketable skills. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here I was, working for one of the largest defense contractors in the country, entrusted with responsibilities they couldn't begin to imagine, and they wanted to help me find entry-level work selling insurance or answering phones. Their genuine concern for my welfare made it even more frustrating. They truly believed they were helping, offering me a lifeline out of what they perceived as professional stagnation. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I'm actually pretty satisfied with my current position. Tech Global is a good company with solid prospects. I think I'll stick with it for now and see where it leads. Jennifer's expression suggested she thought I was being stubborn and short-sighted. David, you can't just coast forever. At some point you need to make decisions that actually move your life forward. This security guard thing might feel comfortable because it's not demanding, but comfort zones are where careers go to die. Amy cleared her throat gently. Maybe David knows something about his job that we don't. Not all opportunities are obvious from the outside. Like what? Kevin challenged. It's corporate security, Amy. It's not rocket science. There's no hidden complexity or secret advancement track. It's exactly what it appears to be. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again with another text message. This one from an unknown number. Package delivered. Pickup scheduled for tomorrow morning. Usual protocols apply. It was coded language that would mean nothing to anyone else at the table, but to me it confirmed that certain wheels were already in motion. Tomorrow was going to be interesting in ways my family couldn't possibly anticipate. The remainder of dinner passed in relative peace, with conversation flowing around safer topics like sports, weather, and local politics. My family seemed relieved to move away from the uncomfortable subject of my career prospects, though I caught them exchanging meaningful glances when they thought I wasn't looking. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere had returned to something approaching normalcy. As everyone began clearing the table and preparing to leave, Jennifer approached me with an expression that mixed genuine concern with barely concealed frustration. David, I know we've been hard on you tonight, but it's only because we care about you. We want to see you succeed, but success requires making smart choices and taking advantage of opportunities. This military phase of your life is over. It's time to move forward. I hugged her goodbye, knowing that within the next few days, everything she thought she understood about my life would be turned upside down. Thanks, Jen. I'll keep that in mind. Kevin shook my hand with that firm grip he'd probably learned in some business school seminar on projecting confidence. Remember, the offer stands. I can make some calls, set up some interviews, but you need to be serious about it. No more of this soldier stuff. Time to join the real world. After everyone left, I helped my parents clean up the kitchen, listening to them rehash the evening's conversations and speculate about my future. They meant well. I knew that, in their minds, they were watching their youngest son waste his potential, squandering his prime years on a dead-end job instead of building towards something meaningful. They had no way of knowing that everything they thought they understood about my situation was carefully constructed misdirection. Driving home through the Phoenix streets, I reflected on the strange double life I'd been living for the past 18 months. During the day, I played the role of David Chen, underachieving security guard, disappointment to his successful family, boyfriend to a woman who was increasingly embarrassed by his lack of ambition. But underneath that carefully maintained facade was a completely different reality, one that would soon intersect with the surface world in ways that would shock everyone who thought they knew me. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment complex. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, probably calling to apologize for missing dinner and hear about how badly it had gone. These post-family gathering phone calls had become a predictable pattern, with Jessica offering sympathy while subtly reinforcing the message that I needed to make better choices. Hey, I answered, parking in my assigned spot next to a dumpster that hadn't been emptied in several days. The glamorous lifestyle of a supposed security guard. David, I'm so sorry about tonight. This project at work just exploded and I couldn't get away. How was dinner with your family? Her voice carried that careful tone people use when they're asking about something they expect to be unpleasant. About what you'd expect. The usual concerns about my career trajectory and life choices. Jennifer thinks I should go back to school. Kevin has job opportunities lined up. My parents are worried about my future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nothing new. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that suggested Jessica was choosing her words carefully. David, can I ask you something? And please don't get defensive. Because I'm asking because I care about you. I unlocked my apartment door, already knowing where this conversation was heading. Sure, go ahead. Do you ever think they might have a point? I mean, I know your military service was important to you, and I respect that. But maybe it's time to consider that civilian life requires different skills, different priorities. Maybe your family sees things you're not seeing. I sat down on my couch, looking around the modest apartment that served as further evidence of my apparent lack of success. The furniture was basic, the decorations minimal, the overall impression one of someone who either couldn't afford better or didn't care enough to try. It was perfect camouflage for someone who needed to blend into the background, to appear unremarkable and unthreatening. Jessica, what if I told you that there's more to my situation than meets the eye? That maybe my family doesn't have the complete picture? Another pause, longer this time. David, I've been thinking about us lately, about where we're going. I care about you. I really do. But I need to be honest about something. When I look at my friends, at people our age who are building lives together, they're making progress, they're buying homes, planning weddings, starting families. They have stability, security, futures they can count on. The conversation I'd been dreading for months was finally happening. Jessica had been growing increasingly distant, increasingly embarrassed by our relationship, increasingly reluctant to introduce me to her colleagues or include me in her social activities. Tonight's missed dinner was just the latest symptom of a problem that had been building for a long time. Are you breaking up with me? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I think we both know this isn't working anymore. You're a good person, David, but we want different things. You seem content with where you are, and I need someone who's ambitious, who's building towards something big, someone who can be a true partner in creating the kind of life I want. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet apartment, processing the events of the day. In the span of a few hours, I'd been lectured by my family about my failures, dumped by my girlfriend for my lack of ambition, and reminded once again that the world I was actually living in bore no resemblance to the world everyone else could see. Tomorrow, I would return to Tech Global Industries, badge in, walk through the security checkpoint I was supposedly responsible for monitoring, and continue playing my role as David Chen, unremarkable security coordinator. But tomorrow would also bring the next phase of an operation that had been months in the planning, an operation that would finally bridge the gap between my two worlds in ways that would shock everyone who thought they knew me. As I prepared for bed that night, I couldn't help but think about the irony of my situation. My family saw failure where there was actually careful strategy. Jessica saw lack of ambition where there was actually patient position. My colleagues at Tech Global saw a quiet security guard where there was actually something much more significant. Tomorrow, some of those perceptions would begin to change, starting a chain of events that would ultimately reveal the truth about who I really was and what I'd actually been doing for the past 18 months. The morning sun streaming through my apartment windows felt different somehow, charged with possibility and anticipation. Today was the day everything would begin to shift, when the careful balance I'd maintained between my public persona and my actual mission would start to tip toward revelation. I dressed in my usual business casual attire, grabbed my Tech Global ID badge, and headed out into a world that had no idea what was coming. The drive to the office took me through the same familiar Phoenix streets I'd traveled hundreds of times before, past the same strip malls and office complexes that had become the backdrop of my supposedly mundane civilian life. But today, everything felt charged with significance. Today, the operation that had been brewing beneath the surface for months would finally begin to emerge into the light. Tech Global Industries occupied a gleaming 40-story tower in downtown Phoenix, its glass and steel facade reflecting the desert sky like a giant mirror. To most people walking past on the street, it appeared to be just another corporate office building, housing just another technology company in a city full of them. They had no idea that within those walls, some of the most sensitive defense contracts in the country were being developed and managed, that the work being done there had implications for national security that reached far beyond Arizona's border. I badged into the building through the main entrance, nodding to the other security personnel as I made my way to the elevator bank. My official workspace was on the 15th floor, a modest cubicle in the Security Operations Center where I was supposed to monitor surveillance feeds and coordinate with various department heads about access protocol. It was exactly the kind of job my family imagined when they pictured my daily routine, and that perception was entirely intentional. But today, instead of heading directly to my assigned floor, I received a text message that changed my destination: Conference Room A, 32nd floor. Immediate attention required. It was the message I'd been waiting for, the signal that Phase 2 of the operation was finally beginning. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt longer than usual, each floor marker lighting up like a countdown to something significant. When the doors opened, I was greeted by Sarah Williams, the HR director, whose usually professional demeanor seemed slightly tense this morning. "David, thank you for coming up so quickly. We have some visitors who specifically requested to meet with you. They're waiting in conference room." Her voice carried an undertone I couldn't quite identify, something between curiosity and apprehension. Conference Room A was Tech Global's primary executive meeting space, an impressive room with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the Phoenix skyline, and a mahogany conference table that could seat 20 people. It was not the kind of space where security coordinators typically found themselves, which made Sarah's nervousness understandable. As far as she knew, I had no business being there. The scene that greeted me when I entered the conference room would have shocked my family into speechlessness. 3 people in military dress uniforms were seated at the conference table, their ribbons and insignia indicating ranks and achievements that commanded respect in any room. At the head of the table sat Marcus Thompson, Tech Global CEO, a man whose presence in the building usually meant major developments were underway, but it was the 4th person in the room who made my pulse quicken with anticipation. General Patricia Hayes, whose gray hair and weathered face told the story of a career spent making decisions that shaped national policy. I hadn't seen her in person since my discharge ceremony 18 months ago, but her presence here meant that everything we'd planned was about to unfold exactly as intended. Thompson stood as I entered the room, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "David, please come in and have a seat. I believe you know General Hayes." The moment had arrived when my two worlds would finally collide, when the careful facade I'd maintained for 18 months would begin to crumble, revealing the truth that would change everything my family, my former girlfriend, and my colleagues thought they knew about me. Tomorrow would bring consequences I could hardly imagine, reactions that would ripple through every relationship in my life, but that's a story for tomorrow. For now, I walked into that conference room, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. General Hayes rose from her chair with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention in any room she entered. Her steel-gray eyes met mine with a mixture of professional respect and something that might have been pride. The silence in Conference Room A stretched for several heartbeats, as the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. "Colonel Chen," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had shaped military policy for over 3 decades. "It's good to see you again." The transformation in the room was immediate and palpable. Sarah Williams, who had been standing near the door with clipboard in hand, went completely still, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning comprehension. Marcus Thompson's expression shifted from professional courtesy to something approaching reverence as he processed what he'd just heard. The 3 uniformed officers at the table straightened imperceptibly, their body language subtly adjusting to acknowledge a superior they hadn't initially recognized. General Hayes, I replied, allowing my military bearing to surface for the first time in 18 months. The change felt like shedding an uncomfortable disguise, dropping the carefully maintained facade of mediocrity that had become second nature. The honor is mine, ma'am. Thompson cleared his throat, his businessman's composure clearly shaken by this unexpected development. I'm sorry, but did you just say Colonel? Our employee records show David as an enlisted veteran, honorably discharged after 8 years of service. There must be some mistake. General Hayes turned toward Thompson with the patient expression of someone accustomed to explaining complex situations to civilians who lacked proper context. Mr. Thompson, there's no mistake. Colonel Chen's service record and current assignment are classified at levels that wouldn't appear in standard employment verification. His presence at Tech Global Industries has been part of a carefully coordinated operation that we're now prepared to bring into the light. Sarah Williams finally found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. Assignment? Current assignment? David works in our security department. He monitors access cards and coordinates with facilities management. He's been here for 18 months doing basic administrative tasks. Miss Williams, I said, turning toward her with what I hoped was a reassuring expression. Everything you've observed has been accurate within its context. I have been monitoring access, coordinating security protocols and maintaining administrative oversight. However, the scope and purpose of those activities extends considerably beyond what appeared in my job description. One of the uniformed officers, a Colonel Martinez, whose ribbon display indicated extensive combat experience, opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a folder marked with security classifications that made Sarah take an involuntary step backward. For the past 18 months, Colonel Chen has been conducting a comprehensive security assessment of Tech Global Industries, evaluating your protocols, identifying vulnerabilities, and developing recommendations for enhanced protection of sensitive defense contracts. Thompson sank into his chair, the implications beginning to cascade through his consciousness like falling dominoes. You're telling me that David, our security coordinator who we've been paying $45,000 a year, is actually a military intelligence officer conducting an investigation of our company? Not an investigation, sir, I clarified, moving to stand at attention beside the conference table. An assessment and enhancement operation. Tech Global Industries holds contracts worth $800 million annually, developing systems critical to national defense. The Pentagon determined that your security infrastructure needed evaluation and improvement to meet evolving threats. My assignment was to conduct that evaluation from within, identifying weaknesses that external audits might miss. General Hayes activated a presentation system that filled the wall-mounted display with organizational charts, security protocols and assessment reports that represented months of careful analysis. Colonel Chen's findings have been instrumental in developing new standards for contractor security that will be implemented across the entire defense industrial base. His work here has prevented 3 separate attempts at industrial espionage and identified 12 critical vulnerabilities that have since been addressed. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her face cycled through several expressions before settling on something between embarrassment and indignation, but he sat in meetings where we discussed his performance review. We talked about his lack of initiative, his failure to engage with corporate culture, his apparent disinterest in advancement opportunities. He never corrected us, never suggested that he was anything other than what his file indicated. Miss Williams, I replied gently, maintaining effective cover required allowing those perceptions to develop naturally. Any attempt to correct them would have compromised the operation and potentially exposed sensitive intelligence requirements. Your assessments were based on accurate observations of my behavior within the limited context available to you. Colonel Martinez consulted his folder again, his expression suggesting he was about to deliver information that would further complicate the situation. There's another dimension to this that Mr. Thompson needs to understand. Colonel Chen's presence at Tech Global wasn't random selection. His background includes specialized training in cybersecurity, industrial counterintelligence, and advanced threat assessment. He holds security clearances that exceed anything previously required for Tech Global contracts. Thompson was beginning to recover from his initial shock, his business instincts reasserting themselves as he processed the strategic implications. What does this mean for Tech Global going forward? Are we going to be subject to ongoing military oversight? Will our operations be restricted or modified based on these findings? Quite the opposite, General Hayes replied, her tone shifting toward something that might have been satisfaction. Colonel Chen's assessment has qualified Tech Global Industries for expanded defense contracts worth approximately $2 billion over the next 5 years. Your security protocols, as enhanced by his recommendations, now meet standards required for our most sensitive project. The silence that followed this announcement was broken only by the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. Sarah Williams sat down heavily in the nearest chair, her professional world having been completely redefined in the span of 10 minutes. Thompson stared at the presentation display, calculating the financial implications of what he'd just learned. Sir, I addressed Thompson directly, there are several immediate changes that will need to be implemented. My official role within Tech Global will transition from covert assessment to overt security oversight. This will require updating my employment records, adjusting my compensation package, and establishing new reporting relationships that align with my actual responsibility. General Hayes consulted her watch, a subtle indication that this briefing was operating on a tight schedule. Mr. Thompson, we'll need your signature on several documents today to formalize these arrangements. Colonel Chen will be promoted to Director of Strategic Security, with authority over all aspects of classified project protection. His annual compensation will be adjusted to reflect both his military rank and his civilian responsibility. Thompson nodded slowly, still processing the magnitude of what he'd learned. What kind of compensation adjustment are we talking about? Colonel Martinez opened another section of his folder, withdrawing a document that he placed in front of Thompson. Colonel Chen's combined military and civilian compensation package will total approximately $320,000 annually, plus performance bonuses tied to contract acquisition and security metrics. Sarah Williams made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. $320,000. We've been paying him $45,000, and wondering why he wasn't more motivated to advance within the company. Ms. Williams, I said, maintaining the professional tone that had become habitual over the past months, my motivation was never in question. My priorities were simply different from what the situation appeared to suggest. The presentation display shifted to show organizational charts that illustrated my new position within Tech Global's hierarchy. Director of Strategic Security reported directly to Thompson, with authority over departments that had previously considered me irrelevant. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. General Hayes stood, indicating that the formal portion of the briefing was concluding. Ms. Thompson, Colonel Chen will need office space appropriate to his new responsibilities, along with support staff and resources necessary to implement the enhanced security protocols. We'll be conducting regular reviews to ensure compliance with Defense Department standards. As the military officials gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Thompson turned toward me with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal curiosity. David, Colonel Chen, I have to ask, how did you maintain this facade for 18 months? How did you sit through performance reviews and team meetings, while knowing that everything we thought we knew about you was wrong? The question touched on something I'd been grappling with throughout this assignment. Sir, compartmentalization is a fundamental skill in intelligence work. The David Chen who attended staff meetings and coordinated badge access was a real person, just not a complete person. That individual existed within specific parameters necessary for the mission. Sarah Williams raised her hand tentatively, as if she were asking permission to speak in a classroom. Will other employees be told about this change? How do we explain that our security coordinator is suddenly Director of Strategic Security? General Hayes paused at the door, addressing this practical concern with the matter-of-fact tone she used for operational details. Ms. Williams, you'll receive guidance on appropriate disclosure level. Some employees will need complete briefings due to their involvement with classified projects. Others will simply be informed of the organizational change without detailed explanation. After the military delegation departed, the conference room felt strangely empty despite Thompson and Sarah still being present. The weight of what had just transpired seemed to settle over all of us like dust after an explosion. Thompson walked to the windows overlooking Phoenix, his reflection ghost-like against the cityscape. This explains so much that never made sense. Your questions during security briefings, your suggestions about access protocols, the way you seem to understand threats that weren't obvious to the rest of us. Sir, if I may, I said, joining him at the window. There were several instances where I wanted to provide more direct guidance, but operational security required maintaining the established cover. There were vulnerabilities I identified in month 3 that couldn't be addressed until month 12 without raising suspicion. Sarah was reviewing the organizational charts still displayed on the wall screen, her finger tracing reporting relationships that placed me in a position of authority over departments that had previously dismissed my input. This is going to create some interesting dynamics. Tom Bradley in facilities management has been treating you like an entry-level employee for over a year. Now he'll be reporting to you on all security-related matters. The mention of Tom Bradley brought a wry smile to my face. Tom had been particularly condescending during our interactions, often questioning whether someone with my limited corporate experience should be making recommendations about access protocols. His reaction to tomorrow's organizational announcement would be worth observing. Thompson returned to the conference table, sitting down across from me with the focused attention of someone preparing for serious negotiations. Colonel David, I need to understand what this means for you personally. You've been living a double life for 18 months. How does it feel to finally drop the pretense? The question was more complex than he probably realized. Sir, the challenging part wasn't maintaining the cover identity. The challenging part was watching people make assumptions about my capabilities and not being able to correct their misperceptions. My family believes I'm a failure. My girlfriend left me because she thought I lacked ambition. Colleagues dismissed my input because they thought I was unqualified. Sarah's expression softened slightly, perhaps understanding for the first time the personal cost of the deception I'd maintained. Your family doesn't know about your military rank. Miss Williams, my family knows I served 8 years in the military and received an honorable discharge. They don't know about my commission, my specialized training, or my current assignment. As far as they're concerned, I'm a disappointing security guard who can't figure out how to build a proper career. Thompson leaned forward, his business instincts engaging with what he clearly saw as a human resources challenge. That's going to change now, obviously. When word gets out about your new position, your compensation, your actual qualifications, it's going to affect every relationship in your life. The observation was accurate but incomplete. Tomorrow's revelations would indeed transform how people perceived me, but the deeper challenge would be rebuilding trust with people who felt they'd been deceived. My family's reaction to learning that their disappointing youngest son was actually a highly decorated military officer would be complex and potentially difficult to navigate. There's something else we need to discuss, Thompson continued, consulting notes he'd taken during the briefing. This enhanced security clearance you mentioned. What kind of restrictions does that place on your personal life, who you associate with, where you travel, what information you can share? The question highlighted one of the ongoing complications of my situation. Sir, the clearance requirements will affect various aspects of my personal interactions, but they shouldn't significantly impact Tech Global's operations. The restrictions primarily involve information handling, foreign contact reporting, and financial disclosure requirements. Sarah had been quietly reviewing the compensation documents that Colonel Martinez had left behind. David, Colonel, I have to ask about something that's been bothering me since this started. You've been living on a $45,000 salary for 18 months. Where was your actual military pay going during this time? It was a perceptive question that touched on operational details I wasn't entirely free to discuss. Ms. Williams, military personnel on special assignment, receive compensation through channels that don't interfere with their cover employment. Those funds have been accumulating in accounts that will become accessible as my role transitions to overt status. Thompson's eyes widened as he calculated the implications. You're telling me that in addition to the new civilian salary, you've been accumulating 18 months of military pay that you haven't been able to access? Approximately, yes, sir. The financial transition will be significant. Sarah shook her head in amazement. Your girlfriend left you because she thought you couldn't afford to build a life with her. Meanwhile, you've been accumulating more money than most people see in 5 years. The irony was painful but accurate. Jessica's decision to end our relationship had been based on her perception that I lacked financial stability and career prospects. She had no way of knowing that my apparent poverty was carefully constructed camouflage for a mission that would ultimately provide more security than she'd ever imagined possible. Thompson stood and walked to his office safe, withdrawing several documents that bore the Tech Global corporate seal. "Colonel, I'm going to need you to sign some paperwork to formalize your new position. There are also liability issues we need to address, given the sensitive nature of your actual work here." As I reviewed the employment agreements that reflected my new status within the company, I couldn't help thinking about how radically my life was about to change. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into Tech Global Industries as Director of Strategic Security, with authority over protocols I'd been quietly developing for months. Department heads who had barely acknowledged my existence would suddenly be seeking my approval for initiatives they'd previously implemented without consultation. The personal transformations would be even more dramatic. My modest apartment in Tempe would need to be replaced with housing appropriate to my security clearance and professional status. The 10-year-old Honda Civic that had served as evidence of my financial limitations would give way to transportation that reflected both my military rank and civilian responsibilities. But the most significant changes would involve relationships with people who thought they knew me. My family's perception of me as a disappointment would be replaced by recognition that their youngest son had achieved success beyond their understanding. Former colleagues would need to reconcile their dismissive attitudes with my actual qualifications and authority. Sarah was organizing the documents we'd signed, her efficiency masking what I suspected was considerable personal discomfort with the situation. "Colonel, when should we expect your transition to begin affecting day-to-day operations? Will there be a formal announcement to staff?" Williams, General Hayes indicated that organizational changes would be implemented immediately. "I suspect tomorrow will bring significant adjustments for everyone involved." Thompson gathered the signed agreements, his expression suggesting he was already planning the communication strategy this would require. "This is going to generate considerable interest from employees who've worked with you over the past 18 months, not to mention questions from people who thought they understood your background and qualifications." The observation was understated. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would shock everyone who had formed opinions about my capabilities based on my carefully maintained cover identity. Tom Bradley in facilities management would discover that the security coordinator he'd been condescending to was actually a military intelligence officer with authority over his entire department. The administrative staff who had pitied my apparent lack of advancement would learn that my position was exactly where I needed to be for reasons they couldn't have imagined. As our meeting concluded and I prepared to leave conference room A, I realized that this was the last day I would experience the strange duality that had defined my life for 18 months. Tomorrow, the careful balance between my public persona and my actual mission would shift permanently toward truth. The consequences of that shift would ripple through every relationship and every assumption people had made about who I was and what I represented. Walking toward the elevator, I reflected on the irony that my family's Thanksgiving dinner criticisms were about to be rendered completely obsolete by revelations they couldn't possibly have anticipated. Jennifer's concerns about my lack of ambition would evaporate when she learned about my promotion to Director of Strategic Security. Kevin's condescending offers to help me find entry-level positions would become laughably inappropriate, given my actual qualifications and compensation. Most significantly, Jessica's decision to end our relationship because she needed someone with greater financial stability and career prospects would prove to have been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my situation. Her perception that I was content with mediocrity would be replaced by recognition that my apparent satisfaction had actually been professional confidence in a mission she couldn't see. The elevator doors closed behind me, carrying me back toward the 15th floor where my old cubicle waited. Tomorrow, that workspace would be replaced by an executive office befitting my new role, but for today I would complete my final shift as David Chen, underachieving security coordinator, knowing that everything was about to change in ways that would astonish everyone who thought they knew me. The transformation would begin at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, when Marcus Thompson would send a company-wide email announcing organizational changes that would fundamentally alter how every employee perceived the quiet security coordinator who had been working among them for over a year. The reactions to that announcement would provide entertainment value that almost compensated for 18 months of carefully maintained deception. As I settled into my modest cubicle for the last time, I began mentally preparing for conversations that would reshape every relationship in my life. Tomorrow would bring revelations, confrontations, and reconciliations that would establish new foundations for moving forward. The mission was concluding successfully, but the personal aftermath was just beginning. The notification appeared on every Tech Global employee's computer screen at exactly 8 o'clock Monday morning, accompanied by the distinctive chime that indicated company-wide announcement. Across 40 floors of the downtown Phoenix Tower, coffee cups paused midway to lips as employees opened the message that would fundamentally alter their understanding of someone they thought they knew. Effective immediately, David Chen has been promoted to Director of Strategic Security, reporting directly to the CEO. Colonel Chen brings extensive military intelligence experience and specialized expertise in defense contractor security protocol. All security-related matters should now be directed through his office on the 35th floor. Please join me in congratulating Colonel Chen on his expanded role within our organization. Marcus Thompson, Chief Executive Officer. The silence that followed could practically be felt through the building's ventilation system. In cubicles and corner offices, employees stared at their screens with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief to dawning comprehension. The security coordinator, who had been wandering the halls for 18 months, checking badge access and coordinating with maintenance staff, was suddenly revealed to be something entirely different. Tom Bradley, Facilities Management Director, read the announcement 3 times before reaching for his phone to call his assistant. His voice carried the strained quality of someone trying to process information that contradicted everything he thought he understood about workplace hierarchy. "Janet, did you see this email about David Chen, the security guy? It says he's been promoted to director level," reporting to Thompson directly. "And what's this about Colonel Chen? Since when is David a colonel?" Janet Morrison had worked at Tech Global for 12 years and prided herself on understanding the complex dynamics of corporate politics. The announcement had left her equally bewildered, particularly given her recent interactions with David during badge system updates. "Mr. Bradley, I'm looking at his personnel file right now and nothing makes sense. According to our records, he's a military veteran with 8 years of enlisted service. There's no mention of officer rank, no indication of specialized training, nothing that would justify this kind of promotion." Meanwhile, 3 floors down in the accounting department, Rebecca Santos was having a similar conversation with her supervisor about the financial implications of what they'd just learned. Rebecca had processed David's bi-weekly paychecks for over a year, and the numbers she was seeing in the new organizational announcement seemed to exist in a different universe from his previous compensation. "Mr. Rodriguez, I need clarification on something. The promotion announcement mentions a salary adjustment for David Chen, but the figures don't align with anything in our existing pay scales. Are we talking about a standard director-level compensation package, or something significantly different?" Carlos Rodriguez, who had been with Tech Global's financial department since its founding, consulted the confidential salary database that accompanied the public announcement. His expression suggested he was reviewing numbers that challenged his understanding of corporate compensation structure. "Rebecca, according to this documentation, David's new compensation package exceeds what we pay most vice presidents. We're looking at a base salary that's 7 times what he was earning last week. Either there's been a significant error in these calculations, or there are aspects of his background that weren't reflected in his original employment file." The reactions weren't limited to administrative confusion. Patricia Shang was explaining to her team of engineers why their security protocols would now be overseen by someone they'd previously considered irrelevant to their work. "I understand the confusion," Zhang said, addressing the 12 PhD-level researchers who comprised Tech Global's Advanced Systems Development Group. "David has been present at our security briefings for months, asking questions that seemed elementary at the time. Now it appears those questions were considerably more sophisticated than we realized." Michael Foster, whose work on satellite communication systems represented some of Tech Global's most sensitive projects, raised his hand with the tentative gesture of someone seeking clarification on a fundamental misunderstanding. "Zhang, are you saying that David's presence at our meetings wasn't coincidental?" that he was specifically evaluating our protocols rather than simply learning about them. The question touched on something that several department heads were beginning to recognize as they reflected on 18 months of interactions with someone they'd dramatically underestimated. David's suggestions about access controls, his questions about information handling procedures, his apparent interest in personnel security clearances, had all seemed like the curiosity of someone trying to understand his limited role within the organization. In the executive suite, Marcus Thompson was fielding phone calls from board members and major clients, who had received copies of the announcement and wanted explanations for what appeared to be a significant change in Tech Global's security leadership. The conversations were requiring him to provide context for decisions that had been made at levels of government classification he couldn't discuss openly. Senator Williams, I understand your concern about continuity in our security protocols, Thompson said, managing his tone carefully during a call with the chair of the Senate Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. Colonel Chen's promotion reflects a recognition of qualifications and experience that weren't initially apparent in his public role within our organization. The senator's response carried the skeptical tone of someone who had spent decades evaluating government contractors and their personnel decisions. Mr. Thompson, Tech Global holds contracts worth nearly $1 billion annually. Changes in security leadership require advance notification to oversight committees. Why are we learning about this after the fact? Thompson consulted the briefing materials that General Hayes had left with him, selecting information that could be shared without compromising operational detail. Senator Colonel Chen's background includes specialized training and clearances that exceed standard requirements for defense contractors. His appointment has been coordinated with appropriate military liaisons and represents an enhancement of our existing capability. While these high-level conversations continued, the ground-level reactions throughout Tech Global were providing their own form of entertainment. Amy Rodriguez, who had defended David during family dinners and social gatherings, was fielding calls from mutual friends who had seen news of his promotion circulating on professional networking sites. Amy, I'm looking at David Chen's LinkedIn profile, and it's been completely updated overnight, said Maria Gonzalez, a former classmate who worked in Phoenix's technology sector. Yesterday he was listed as a security coordinator making $40-something thousand a year. Today he's director of strategic security with military credentials I never knew existed. Amy found herself in the unusual position of being one of the few people outside Tech Global who had suspected there was more to David's situation than met the eye. Her conversations with him had occasionally touched on subjects that seemed inconsistent with his apparent role, though she'd never imagined the extent of the deception. David always struck me as someone who was operating at a different level than his job title suggested. I just assumed he was overqualified for his position and working his way up through the organization. The most dramatic reactions were occurring in departments that had directly dismissed David's input over the past 18 months. In IT security, Director James Wilson was reviewing email chains and meeting minutes that documented his responses to suggestions from someone he'd considered unqualified to understand cybersecurity protocol. Linda, I need you to pull all communications between our department and David Chen for the past year, Wilson instructed his assistant, his voice carrying the tight control of someone recognizing a significant professional misjudgment. I want to review every recommendation he made that we declined to implement. Linda Peterson had been present at several meetings where Wilson had dismissed David's questions about network security as naive inquiries from someone without technical background. The revelation that those questions had come from a military intelligence officer was forcing a complete re-evaluation of those interactions. Mr. Wilson, should I also gather the documentation from the 3 security assessments where David identified vulnerabilities that we initially discounted, the ones where he suggested additional protocols that we decided were unnecessary? Wilson's expression suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his misjudgment. Yes, get everything. I have a feeling those unnecessary protocols are about to become mandatory requirements. The personnel files that Sarah Williams was reviewing painted a picture of systematic misdirection that had been maintained with remarkable consistency. David's employment application, his interview notes, his performance evaluations, Even his emergency contact information had all supported the carefully constructed identity of an underqualified security coordinator seeking stable employment. "Miss Thompson," Sarah said during their afternoon meeting to discuss the transition logistics, "I've been reviewing every document related to David's employment, and the level of detail in this cover identity is extraordinary. His references, his salary negotiations, even his responses to team-building exercises, were all perfectly consistent with someone operating at the level we believed him to represent." Thompson was beginning to appreciate the sophisticated nature of the operation that had been conducted within his organization. "Sarah, what's your assessment of how other employees are handling this revelation? Are we looking at morale issues, trust concerns, questions about management's competence?" The question touched on legitimate concerns about how such a significant deception might affect workplace dynamics. Employees who had dismissed David's input might feel embarrassed or defensive. Others might question whether similar operations were being conducted by other seemingly ordinary colleagues. "Sir, the reactions are varied, but there's definitely a sense that everyone is re-evaluating their assumptions about people and situations." Tom Bradley called this morning asking whether he needed to apologize for 18 months of condescending interactions. Janet Morrison wants to know if she should have recognized signs that David wasn't who he appeared to be. The afternoon brought a steady stream of interdepartmental communications as various managers sought guidance on how to adjust their working relationships with someone whose authority had increased dramatically overnight. The security protocols that David had been quietly developing were suddenly being implemented across departments that had previously operated with minimal oversight. Zhang received a memo outlining new clearance requirements for her research team, protocols that addressed vulnerabilities she hadn't known existed. The recommendations bore David's signature but reflected insights that seemed to come from sources far beyond his apparent experience level. "These protocols are remarkably sophisticated," Dr. Zhang told her team during their weekly meeting. "They address threat vectors that weren't obvious to any of us, including some international espionage risks that I wouldn't have considered relevant to our work." Foster was reviewing the same documentation with growing respect for analysis he'd previously dismissed. "The electromagnetic signature protocols alone demonstrate understanding of adversary capabilities that aren't public knowledge. Where would David have acquired this kind of specialized intelligence?" The question was being asked throughout Tech Global as employees tried to reconcile their previous perceptions with the emerging reality of David's qualification. The transition wasn't just about organizational charts and reporting relationships. It was about fundamentally redefining their understanding of someone they'd worked alongside for over a year. In the building's parking garage, maintenance supervisor Rick Martinez was explaining to his crew why their security procedures would now be subject to oversight from someone they'd previously considered a peer, rather than a supervisor. "Guys, I know this is confusing because David's been treating us like equals for 18 months. Turns out he was being polite, not acknowledging that he outranked all of us by about 6 levels. The crew had interacted with David regularly during routine maintenance operations, and his friendly, unpretentious demeanor had made him popular among the building's service staff. The revelation that their colleague was actually a military officer conducting classified assessment work was requiring significant mental adjustment. "Rick," asked Tony Silva, the lead electrician, "does this mean all those questions David asked about our access procedures and equipment inventories weren't just friendly curiosity? Was he actually evaluating our security practice?" The realization was spreading throughout the organization that 18 months of apparently casual interactions had actually been systematic intelligence gathering conducted by someone with expertise they'd never suspected. Conversations that had seemed like workplace small talk were being reconsidered as professional assessment activity. Meanwhile, word of David's promotion was beginning to circulate beyond Tech Global's walls, reaching the wider Phoenix business community and generating interest from people who knew him in other contexts. His neighbors at the modest apartment complex in Tempe were receiving updates from friends and family members who had seen the news through professional networks. Margaret Chen, David's elderly neighbor who had often worried about his financial stability, was processing information that completely contradicted her understanding of his circumstance. She had frequently offered him home-cooked meals and assistance with grocery costs, gestures of kindness that now seemed both touching and unnecessary. The apartment complex manager, Steve Johnson, was fielding inquiries from local reporters who had picked up the story as an example of dramatic career advancement within Phoenix's defense industry. The narrative of a security coordinator's unexpected promotion to executive level was generating human interest coverage that extended beyond typical business reporting. Ms. Johnson, we understand that David Chen has been a tenant at your property for over 18 months, said Channel 12 News reporter Amanda Foster. Were there any indications that he might be operating at a professional level significantly above what his living situation suggests? Johnson found himself in the uncomfortable position of discussing a tenant whose privacy had been carefully maintained, but whose public profile had suddenly expanded dramatically. David has always been a quiet, responsible tenant who paid his rent on time and didn't cause any problem. He seemed like someone who was working hard to build his career. The media attention was creating additional complications for David's transition from covert to overt status. His carefully maintained low profile was being replaced by professional visibility that would affect every aspect of his personal life. The modest lifestyle that had served as effective camouflage would need to be adjusted to reflect his actual position and compensation. Back at Tech Global, the practical implications of David's revelation were beginning to affect daily operations in ways that extended far beyond organizational charts. Department heads were requesting meetings to discuss security enhancements they hadn't realized were necessary. Project managers were seeking guidance on clearance requirements that hadn't previously applied to their work. The transformation was forcing everyone to reconsider not just their understanding of David, but their assumptions about security, authority, and the nature of information that had been flowing through their organization. The quiet security coordinator who had seemed peripheral to most operations was suddenly revealed as someone who had been central to protecting everything they were doing. As the day progressed, it became clear that the ripple effects of David's revelation would continue expanding for weeks or months to come. Relationships would need to be rebuilt on new foundations. Protocols would need to be adjusted to reflect reality rather than appearance. Most significantly, everyone who had interacted with David would need to process the fact that their perceptions had been fundamentally incorrect for over a year. The morning's announcement had been just the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately affect every aspect of how Tech Global operated and how its employees understood their roles within the organization. David's emergence from carefully maintained anonymity would reshape the entire corporate culture in ways that were only beginning to become apparent. The text message arrived on Jennifer's phone while she was reviewing depositions in her downtown Phoenix law office. The sender was Kevin's business associate, Mark Patterson, whose connections in the defense industry often provided valuable networking opportunities for their social circle. Jennifer, saw the news about your brother David, had no idea he was military intelligence. My contacts at the Pentagon say his promotion is a really big deal. Might want to reconsider those family dinner conversations. Jennifer stared at the message for several minutes before forwarding it to Kevin with a single question mark. Her husband's response came back immediately, suggesting he was equally puzzled by the reference to news about David that neither of them had seen. Check Channel 12's website, business section. You're not going to believe this. The article that greeted Jennifer's search was accompanied by a photograph that showed David in military dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons and commendations that seemed to belong to someone entirely different from the disappointing younger brother she'd lectured 3 days earlier about his lack of ambition and career direction. Local defense contractor promotes military intelligence officer to executive role. Tech Global Industries announced today that security coordinator David Chen has been elevated to director of strategic security, revealing that the employee had been conducting classified assessment operations while maintaining cover as entry-level personnel. Colonel Chen's background includes specialized training in counterintelligence and advanced threat assessment, qualifications that were not reflected in his public role within the organization. Jennifer's hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through additional details that painted a picture of her brother that contradicted everything she thought she knew about his post-military life. The article mentioned compensation packages, security clearances, and responsibilities that placed him in a completely different professional category than the failure she'd been pitying for the past 18 months. Her office phone rang, displaying Kevin's number with the urgent tone he used for situations that required immediate attention. Jennifer, Are you reading? Your brother, the one we've been worried about because he couldn't find a real job, is apparently a military intelligence officer making more money than both of us combined. What the hell is going on? Jennifer's voice carried the stunned quality of someone processing information that fundamentally challenged her worldview. Kevin, I'm looking at a picture of David in a colonel's uniform. When did he become a colonel? When did he become anything other than an enlisted soldier who couldn't figure out what to do with his life? That's what I'm trying to understand. According to this article, he's been working undercover at Tech Global for 18 months, conducting some kind of classified operation while we've been treating him like he couldn't manage his own finance. The implications were cascading through Jennifer's consciousness like a controlled demolition of assumptions she'd built her understanding of family dynamics upon. The brother she'd lectured about career advancement had actually achieved success that exceeded her own professional accomplishment. The military service she'd dismissed as a phase he needed to outgrow had actually prepared him for responsibilities she couldn't begin to comprehend. Kevin, we need to call my parents. They need to see this before someone else tells them about it. Robert Chen was in his home office reviewing retirement investment portfolios when his daughter's call interrupted his concentration. His first assumption was that Jennifer was calling to continue their post-Thanksgiving discussion about David's disappointing life choices and what the family might do to help him develop more realistic career goals. Jennifer, if this is about David's situation, I've been thinking we might consider staging some kind of intervention. Your mother's worried that he's becoming too comfortable with mediocrity. Dad, you need to sit down and open your computer. Go to Channel 12's website and look at the business section. There's something about David that's going to change everything we thought we understood about his situation. Robert's confusion was evident in his voice as he navigated to the website his daughter had specified. Jennifer, what kind of news story could there possibly be about David? He works in building security for some technology company. The silence that followed suggested Robert was processing the same cognitive dissonance that Jennifer had experienced moments earlier. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to reconcile contradictory information. Jennifer, there's a picture here of your brother in a military uniform I've never seen before. The article says he's been promoted to director level at his company, but it also mentions intelligence work and classified operations. Is this some kind of mistake, some confusion with another David Chen? Dad, that's what I thought initially, but the details are too specific. The article mentions Tech Global Industries, which is where David works. It mentions his 8 years of military service. It has quotes from his CEO about his qualifications and experience. This isn't a case of mistaken identity. Robert was scrolling through the article with growing amazement, his accountant's attention to detail forcing him to acknowledge information that contradicted his fundamental assumptions about his youngest son's capabilities and achievement. It says here that David holds security clearances that exceed what most defense contractors require. It mentions specialized training in counterintelligence and threat assessment. Jennifer, where would David have acquired these qualifications? When would he have received this training? The question highlighted a gap in their family's understanding that was becoming increasingly apparent. David's 8 years of military service had been acknowledged but never explored in detail. His parents and sister had known he'd served overseas, known he'd received commendations, but they'd never inquired about the specific nature of his duties or the skills he'd developed. Dad, I think we've been making assumptions about David's military experience, based on our own limited understanding of what military service involved. We assumed he was just another enlisted soldier doing basic duties, but apparently there's a whole dimension of his background that he never shared with us. Robert's wife Linda entered his office as he was processing this information, her expression suggesting she'd received similar communications from other family members or friends who had seen the news coverage. Robert, I just got off the phone with my sister Carol, and she says there's something on the news about David, something about him being promoted to an executive position and having a military rank we didn't know about. She saw it on Facebook and wanted to know if we were aware of these developments. The conversation that followed required Robert to explain to his wife that their son's life contained dimensions they'd never suspected, achievements they'd never recognized, and qualifications that placed him in professional categories they'd never considered relevant to his situation. Linda, according to this article, David has been working undercover for the past 18 months, conducting classified assessment work while maintaining the appearance of being an entry-level security coordinator. His actual rank is colonel, not the enlisted status we assumed, and his compensation is being adjusted to reflect responsibilities we never knew he had. Linda sat down heavily in the nearest chair, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning comprehension. Robert, are you telling me that when we were lecturing David about his lack of ambition and career direction, he was actually performing classified intelligence work for the military? The question captured the essence of their predicament perfectly. The family intervention they'd been planning, the concerns about David's future, the disappointment in his apparent lack of achievement, had all been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of his actual situation. Meanwhile, across town in his Scottsdale office, Kevin Martinez was dealing with his own professional complications, stemming from the revelation about his brother-in-law's true status. Kevin's position at Goldman Sachs required him to maintain relationships with clients in the defense industry, several of whom had already contacted him, seeking information about David's background and qualification. Kevin, this is Margaret Thompson from Lockheed Martin's Phoenix operations, came the voice on his office phone. I understand your brother-in-law is David Chin, the new director of strategic security at Tech Global. We're interested in exploring some collaborative opportunities and wondered if you might facilitate an introduction. Kevin found himself in the unusual position of being contacted for networking access to someone he'd been pitying and condescending to just days earlier. The brother-in-law he'd offered to help find entry-level employment was suddenly being sought after by major defense contractors for his expertise and connection. Margaret, I'd be happy to facilitate that introduction, though I should mention that David's new responsibilities might limit his availability for external consultations. His role at Tech Global appears to involve significant classified work. After ending the call, Kevin stared out his office window at the Phoenix skyline, processing the implications of what he'd learned about David's actual professional status. The advice he'd offered about business networking and career development had been directed toward someone whose connections and qualifications exceeded his own by substantial margin. The phone calls continued throughout the afternoon as word spread through Phoenix's interconnected business and social network. David's promotion was being covered, not just as a human interest story, but as a significant development in the region's defense industry that had implications for contract awards and security protocols across multiple organizations. Amy Rodriguez was experiencing her own version of cognitive adjustment, as she fielded inquiries from mutual friends who remembered her defending David during social gatherings, where others had questioned his career choices and financial stability. Amy, I owe you an apology, said Maria Gonzalez during their afternoon phone conversation. Remember last month when we were discussing David's situation, and you said there might be more to his story than was obvious? I dismissed that as wishful thinking on your part, but apparently you were more perceptive than the rest of us. Amy had indeed suspected that David's apparent underachievement was inconsistent with other aspects of his personality and behavior, though she'd never imagined the extent to which appearances had been deceiving. Maria, David always struck me as someone who was operating with information and perspective that wasn't immediately obvious. His comments about security issues, his understanding of international affairs, his confidence despite apparent financial limitations. In retrospect, there were signs that he was working at a different level than his job title suggested. The revelation was forcing everyone in David's extended social network to reconsider their assumptions and judgments about someone they'd thought they understood. Friends who had offered career advice were realizing they'd been presumptuous. Family members who had expressed concern about his future were discovering their concerns had been misplaced. But the most significant adjustments were occurring within David's immediate family as they grappled with the realization that their disappointment in his achievements had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what he'd actually been achieving. Robert Chen called his son's phone that evening, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic uncertainty as he attempted to bridge the gap between his previous perceptions and his new understanding. David, your mother and I have been reading about your promotion and your military background. We're trying to understand why you never shared information about your rank and your specialized training with your family. David's response was measured and patient, though it carried undertones of someone who had endured months of criticism based on incomplete information. Dad, my assignment required maintaining operational security that extended to personal relationships. Sharing details about my military rank or my actual responsibilities at Tech Global would have compromised the mission I was conducting. But David, we've been worried about your future, concerned about your financial stability, disappointed in what we perceived as your lack of ambition. If we had known about your actual qualifications and responsibilities, we would never have expressed those concerns. The conversation highlighted the delicate balance David had been maintaining between family relationships and professional obligation. His parents' criticism had been painful precisely because he couldn't correct their misperceptions without violating the operational security requirements of his assignment. Dad, I understand the family's concerns were motivated by caring, but I couldn't provide clarification without jeopardizing work that affects national security. The personal cost of maintaining that cover was something I had to accept as part of the mission. Jennifer joined the conference call from her law office, her voice carrying the professional composure she used when acknowledging significant errors in legal strategy. David, I owe you an apology for the things I said during Thanksgiving dinner. I was operating with incomplete information and made judgments about your career that were completely inappropriate. I'm embarrassed by how presumptuous and condescending I was. The apology was sincere but also reflected Jennifer's lawyer instincts for damage control when faced with evidence that her position had been fundamentally flawed. Her concerns about David's professional trajectory had been replaced by recognition that his career path was both more complex and more successful than she'd imagined possible. Jennifer, no apology is necessary. Your concerns were based on reasonable observations given the information available to you. The fact that those observations were incomplete wasn't something you could have known without access to classified detail. Kevin's voice joined the conversation as he participated from his home office, his tone suggesting he was still processing the implications of what he'd learned about his brother-in-law's actual status. David, I feel particularly foolish about offering to help you find entry-level positions through my business contacts. Apparently your professional network and qualifications exceed anything I could have provided access to. The conversation continued for over an hour, as family members sought to understand not just the facts of David's situation, but the personal experience of maintaining such an extensive deception while enduring their criticism and concern. The emotional complexity of his position was becoming apparent as they realized the discipline required to accept their disapproval rather than correct their misunderstanding. The difficult part, David explained, wasn't maintaining the cover identity at work. Tech Global's employees had no baseline for comparison, so they accepted the persona I presented. The challenging aspect was family gatherings where people who loved me were expressing disappointment in achievements they couldn't see. Linda Chen's voice carried the emotional weight of a mother recognizing that her son had been carrying burdens she'd never suspected while she'd been adding to his stress with concerns about his future. David, how long will your current assignment continue? Will you be able to share more details about your work now that your cover has been revealed? Mom, my role is transitioning from covert assessment to overt security oversight, which means I'll have more freedom to discuss general aspects of my responsibilities. However, many details will remain classified due to the sensitive nature of defense contractor security protocols. As the family call concluded, each participant was left to process the magnitude of their misunderstanding and its implications for future relationships. The brother and son they'd been concerned about was actually the most professionally successful member of their family, operating at levels of responsibility and authority they'd never imagined him capable of achieving. The revelation would require rebuilding their understanding of David's capabilities, adjusting their expectations for his future, and processing the uncomfortable reality that their concerns had been both misplaced and potentially harmful to someone who had been serving his country while enduring their criticism. Tomorrow would bring additional complications as word continued to spread through their extended social network, generating reactions that would further highlight the extent to which appearances had been deceiving and assumptions had been wrong. The family that had gathered for Thanksgiving dinner believing they understood each other's circumstances was discovering that one of their most fundamental assumptions had been completely incorrect. The phone calls and conversations would continue for days as friends, relatives, and acquaintances processed the news and adjusted their understanding of someone they'd thought they knew. But the most significant transformation would be within the Chen family itself, as they rebuilt their relationships on foundations of truth rather than carefully constructed deception. The restaurant Jessica had chosen for what she'd described as an important conversation was the same upscale steakhouse in Old Town Scottsdale where she'd often complained about not being able to afford the menu prices during their relationship. Her text message had been carefully worded, expressing regret about their breakup and hope that they might find a way to reconnect now that circumstances had changed. David arrived precisely on time, noting the irony that Jessica had selected a venue that would have strained his apparent budget when they were together but was now easily affordable given his actual compensation. He spotted her immediately at a corner table, her appearance suggesting she'd invested considerable effort in looking her best for this encounter. "David, thank you so much for meeting me," Jessica said, rising to offer a hug that felt both familiar and awkward. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and I realize I may have made a terrible mistake." Her smile carried the practiced warmth she used in her marketing career when trying to rebuild relationships with clients after misunderstanding. The calculated nature of her approach was immediately apparent to someone trained in recognizing manipulation tactics. "Jessica, I appreciate you reaching out, though I'm curious about what prompted this change of perspective. When we last spoke, you were quite definitive about our incompatibility and your need for someone with different priorities." Jessica settled into her chair with visible nervousness, clearly having rehearsed this conversation but uncertain about how to navigate the delicate territory of acknowledging her error in judgment. "David, I had no idea about your military background, your actual rank, your real responsibilities at Tech Global. If I had understood the true nature of your situation, I never would have made the assumptions I made about our future together." The admission confirmed what David had suspected about Jessica's motivations for ending their relationship and her current interest in reconciliation. Her decision-making had been based entirely on financial calculations and social status considerations, rather than any genuine evaluation of their compatibility or emotional connection. "Jessica, what specifically would have been different if you had known about my military rank or my compensation package? Would that information have changed your feelings about me as a person, or would it have simply altered your assessment of my financial prospects?" The question was more direct than Jessica had anticipated, forcing her to confront the materialistic foundation of her relationship decisions. Her response revealed the uncomfortable truth that her interest in David was directly proportional to his perceived earning potential and social status. "David, that's not fair. Of course I cared about you as a person. But relationships require practical considerations too: financial stability, career prospects, the ability to build a life together. When I thought you were content with a basic security job, I worried we weren't compatible in terms of our long-term goals. And now that you know my actual position and compensation, those compatibility concerns have been resolved." Jessica's discomfort was becoming increasingly evident as David's questions forced her to acknowledge the transactional nature of her relationship philosophy. The romantic reunion she'd envisioned was being replaced by an uncomfortable examination of her values and priorities. "David, I know how this looks, but you have to understand my perspective. I'm 28 years old, and most of my friends are getting married, buying houses, starting families. I need to be with someone who can provide the stability and security necessary for that kind of future." "Jessica, I provided exactly that stability and security throughout our relationship. The only thing that's changed is your awareness of the numbers involved. My character, my reliability, my commitment to you remained constant regardless of what appeared on my pay stub." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ryan Cooper, Jessica's new boyfriend, whose unexpected appearance suggested this encounter had been planned with more complexity than Jessica had initially indicated. Ryan's confident stride and expensive suit projected the image of success that Jessica had found lacking in her perception of David's circumstance. "Sorry I'm late," Ryan announced, extending his hand toward David with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to networking events and business dinners. Ryan Cooper, regional manager for Pinnacle Financial. Jessica's told me so much about you. David accepted the handshake while processing the implications of this arranged encounter. Ryan's presence transformed the meeting from a potential reconciliation attempt into something resembling a confrontation or comparison exercise that Jessica had orchestrated. Mr. Cooper, pleasure to meet you. Jessica didn't mention you'd be joining us this evening. Ryan settled into the third chair at their table with the easy confidence of someone who believed he occupied a position of social and economic superiority. His body language and conversational tone suggested he viewed this meeting as an opportunity to demonstrate his advantages over Jessica's former boyfriend. David, I hope you don't mind me crashing your dinner, but when Jessica mentioned she was meeting with you, I was curious to meet the guy she's been telling me about. Sounds like you've had some interesting career developments lately. The condescending undertone in Ryan's voice was unmistakable, suggesting he'd been briefed on David's recent promotion but remained convinced of his own superior status. His reference to interesting career developments carried the dismissive quality of someone who viewed military service as inferior to civilian business achievement. Ryan, I'm sure Jessica has provided you with whatever context she felt was relevant. What line of work are you in at Pinnacle Financial? Investment management, primarily high net worth clients in the Phoenix area. We handle portfolios in the 8 and 9-figure range, advising people on wealth preservation and growth strategy. It's challenging work, but the compensation reflects the responsibility. Ryan's response was clearly intended to establish his professional credentials and financial status, positioning himself as someone operating at levels that would impress or intimidate David. The strategy might have been effective if Ryan had possessed accurate information about David's actual circumstances. Jessica watched this exchange with growing anxiety, apparently recognizing that her attempt to manage the situation was becoming increasingly complicated. Her original plan seemed to have involved demonstrating to David what he had lost while simultaneously showing Ryan that her previous relationship hadn't been as significant as he might have feared. Ryan manages some of the largest investment accounts in Arizona, Jessica added, her voice carrying forced enthusiasm. His clients include several Fortune 500 executives and professional athletes. It's exactly the kind of career trajectory I'm looking for in a partner. David nodded politely while observing the dynamics between Jessica and Ryan, noting the performative nature of their interactions and Jessica's obvious effort to impress both men simultaneously. That sounds like demanding work, Ryan. I imagine managing other people's wealth requires considerable expertise and attention to detail. Absolutely. Though I have to say, David, I'm impressed by your recent promotion. Moving from security coordinator to director level is quite an achievement. Jessica mentioned you were in the military before transitioning to civilian work. Ryan's tone suggested he viewed David's military service as a reasonable stepping stone toward legitimate business success, but inferior to his own civilian career path. His lack of understanding about military intelligence operations was evident in his casual dismissal of David's background. Yes, I served 8 years before joining Tech Global Industries. The transition from military to civilian work has been an interesting learning experience. I bet military skills don't always translate directly to business environments, but it sounds like you've managed to adapt pretty well. What's your new position paying, if you don't mind me asking? Jessica mentioned Tech Global is a solid company. The question was inappropriate for casual conversation, but Ryan's confident delivery suggested he expected David to be impressed by his directness and worldly sophistication. Jessica's expression indicated she was mortified by Ryan's tactless inquiry but felt unable to intervene. Ryan, compensation discussions might not be appropriate for dinner conversation, but I appreciate your interest in my professional development. Ryan's laugh carried the forced quality of someone who had expected a different response to his power play attempt. Of course. I didn't mean to pry. It's just that in my business, we're always evaluating people's financial situations to understand their investment needs and risk tolerance. The explanation was clearly improvised, an attempt to justify his inappropriate question as professional curiosity rather than personal competitiveness. David's refusal to engage with the financial comparison had disrupted Ryan's planned demonstration of superiority. Jessica attempted to redirect the conversation toward safer territory, though her nervousness was becoming increasingly apparent. David, Ryan and I were just discussing some vacation plans for next month. We're thinking about Cabo San Lucas, staying at one of those luxury resorts. The mention of expensive vacation plans was another calculated attempt to demonstrate the lifestyle she was enjoying with Ryan, contrasting it with the financial limitations she had perceived in her relationship with David. The strategy was becoming transparently manipulative. "That sounds wonderful, Jessica. I hope you both enjoy the trip." David's genuine response seemed to frustrate both Jessica and Ryan, who had apparently expected jealousy or competitive reaction to their display of affluence. His calm acceptance of their relationship and financial situation wasn't providing the dramatic confrontation they seemed to have anticipated. "What about you, David?" Ryan pressed, clearly determined to establish some form of competitive dynamic. "Any travel plans now that your career situation has improved? I imagine director-level positions come with better vacation benefits." The persistence of Ryan's attempts to engage in financial competition was becoming almost comical, particularly given his complete ignorance of David's actual compensation and benefits package. Jessica's increasingly uncomfortable expression suggested she was beginning to recognize the inappropriate nature of her boyfriend's behavior. "I'm fortunate to have flexibility in my schedule that allows for travel when circumstances permit. The nature of my work at Tech Global does provide certain advantages." Before Ryan could respond with another inappropriate inquiry, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Thompson and his wife at a nearby table. Thompson's recognition of David was immediate, and his approach to their table created a dynamic that neither Jessica nor Ryan had anticipated. "Colonel Chen, what a pleasant surprise to see you here," Thompson said, his voice carrying the respectful tone he used when addressing military officers and senior executives. "I hope you're enjoying your evening." The transformation in Jessica's expression was immediate and profound as she processed the implications of Tech Global's CEO addressing David with military rank and obvious deference. Ryan's confident demeanor faltered noticeably as he recognized that his assumptions about social hierarchy were being challenged by someone whose authority exceeded his own. "Mr. Thompson, good to see you as well. Please allow me to introduce Jessica Martinez and Ryan Coop." "Jessica, Ryan, this is Marcus Thompson, CEO of Tech Global Industries." Thompson's handshake with Ryan was polite but brief, his attention clearly focused on David as the person of primary importance at the table. The dynamic completely inverted the power structure that Ryan had been attempting to establish throughout the evening. "Colonel, I wanted to mention that the Pentagon briefing went extremely well yesterday. General Hayes specifically commended your analysis of the vulnerability assessment. The recommendations you developed are being implemented across the entire defense contractor network." Jessica's face had gone pale as she processed references to Pentagon briefings and general officers that placed David in professional circles far beyond anything she had imagined. Ryan's expression suggested he was beginning to understand that his attempts at establishing superiority had been directed towards someone operating at levels he couldn't comprehend. "Thank you, sir. I'm pleased the assessment proved valuable for broader security enhancement initiatives." Thompson's smile indicated his awareness that this casual encounter was having significant impact on David's dinner companion. "Well, I don't want to interrupt your evening further, but I wanted you to know that the Secretary of Defense's office has specifically requested your participation in the upcoming Contractor Security Symposium. Your expertise is becoming quite sought after at the highest level." After Thompson departed, the silence at their table stretched uncomfortably as Jessica and Ryan processed what they had witnessed. The casual mention of Pentagon briefings, general officers, and Secretary of Defense communications had completely undermined their assumptions about David's professional status and importance. "David," Jessica said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I had no idea you were working at that level. When you said you worked in security at Tech Global, I never imagined it involved Pentagon briefings and Defense Department communication." Ryan's competitive confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by the awkward recognition that his attempts to establish superiority had been directed toward someone whose actual authority and compensation exceeded his own by substantial margin. His investment management role, impressive within civilian business circles, was insignificant compared to national security responsibilities. "Jessica, Ryan, I hope you understand that many aspects of my work require discretion and can't be discussed in detail. The nature of defense contractor security involves responsibilities that aren't always apparent from external observation. The remainder of their dinner passed in uncomfortable conversation as Jessica and Ryan struggled to adjust their understanding of David's circumstance. Jessica's attempts at reconciliation had been based on incomplete information about his promotion, and the full scope of his status was far beyond what she had imagined when planning this encounter. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Jessica made one final attempt to address the situation she had created. David, I realize now how completely I misunderstood your circumstance. If there's any possibility of rebuilding what we had, I want you to know that I'm genuinely sorry for the mistakes I made. David's response was gentle but definitive, reflecting both understanding and closure. Jessica, I appreciate your apology, and I understand that your decisions were based on the information available to you. However, the fundamental incompatibility wasn't about money or career status. It was about values and priorities that haven't changed regardless of what you now know about my compensation. Walking to his car in the restaurant parking lot, David reflected on the evening's events and the broader transformation his life had undergone over the past week. The revelation of his true status had changed how everyone perceived him, but it had also clarified which relationships were based on genuine connection versus transactional consideration. His phone buzzed with a text message from Amy Rodriguez, whose friendship had remained constant throughout his time maintaining cover and during the recent revelations about his background. David, saw you on the news again tonight. Pentagon symposium sounds impressive. Hope all this attention isn't too overwhelming. Coffee this weekend if you want to talk to someone who liked you just fine when you were supposedly broke. The message captured the essential difference between relationships built on authentic foundation versus those dependent on external circumstance. Amy's loyalty during his apparent professional struggles had been genuine, making her friendship valuable in ways that transcended financial considerations or social status. Driving home through the Phoenix streets, David considered how the past 18 months of carefully maintained deception had ultimately served purposes beyond his military mission. The experience had revealed the true nature of relationships and priorities in ways that might not have been apparent under ordinary circumstances. His family's love had been genuine despite their misguided criticism, and their relationship would recover and strengthen based on new understanding and mutual respect. Jessica's materialistic calculations had been exposed as incompatible with meaningful partnership. Ryan's competitive insecurities had been revealed as fundamentally shallow. Most importantly, the mission itself had been successful beyond original parameters, providing security enhancements that would protect critical defense infrastructure while demonstrating the value of patient, methodical intelligence work conducted by dedicated professionals operating in the shadows. The phone rang as he arrived at his apartment complex, displaying General Hayes's number with timing that suggested she had been monitoring the public aspects of his transition from covert to overt status. Colonel Chen, I wanted to check on how you're managing the adjustment to public recognition. These transitions can be challenging both professionally and personally. General, the professional aspects have been smooth, thanks to excellent coordination with tech global leadership. The personal adjustments are ongoing, but manageable. Family relationships are stabilizing on new foundations, and other connections are sorting themselves according to their genuine nature. That's exactly what we hope to hear. Your performance throughout this operation has been exemplary, and the intelligence value has exceeded all projections. We're looking forward to your continued contributions in your expanded role. As David settled into his apartment for the final time before moving to accommodations more appropriate to his actual status, he reflected on the complex journey that had brought him to this point. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter where his public identity finally aligned with his actual capabilities and responsibilities. The mission had taught him valuable lessons about perception, reality, and the importance of patient professionalism in achieving long-term objectives. But perhaps most significantly, it had revealed which relationships and values could withstand the test of adversity and misunderstanding. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.